Hello and welcome to Solomoriah Speaks, episode 16, Accommodation. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Several things that happened in the last year have kind of brought this to the forefront of my mind. Accommodation. Making the game accessible. I don't like accessibility specifically as a word, but making the game accessible to your players. Making it where every player has as good an experience as they can playing the game. Now, again, specifically we're talking about tabletop RPGs. I'm not talking about any specific game in particular in this episode. I'll start in the obvious place, which is the most recent event. One of my regular online players has a significant visual limitation. He has difficulty seeing things that don't have enough contrast and picking out small detail. And after a recent game session, I was talking with other players. That particular player was unable to attend that game. And of course, what do you do when someone doesn't make the group? You talk about them. But we were talking about the issues that he had and what we could do to make things better for him. And one of the other players said, "Have you thought about putting colored circles under the tokens?" And I'm like, well, that's genius. Instead of looking for more or less figure-shaped top-down, we use top-down figures, but instead of looking for more or less figure-shaped icons, he'd be looking for relatively visible circles. Roughly the diameter be equal to the size of a square on the map. Much easier to see, easier to pick out for me, and certainly easier to pick out for him. It was a genius idea, and I spent the next couple of days, basically any free time I had, loading up the tokens we were already using and dropping rings or circles behind them so that we can see them. I've got a sample I'm showing on the screen, and I think this not only helps him, it actually kind of helps me. I think the visibility is going to be better for me in a lot of situations, a lot of the maps that we use, but if you're listening to this, if you're watching this, and you've been doing this for any length of time at all, you're probably saying, well, duh, of course you do those things if you have a friend who has a visual limitation or some other limitation that makes the game difficult for them to approach. You do what you can to make that easier, and this is pretty obvious. The whole, well, it's obvious he doesn't see well. We know he doesn't see well. We do a thing to make it easier for him to see what needs to be seen, and he's able to participate. And this is how we want it to be. Another subject that's come up in the last year, particularly that I have been kind of paying attention to, is the idea of having a session 0, where players and the game master discuss the things that may be happening in the upcoming campaign. The sorts of events that might be uncomfortable or triggering for the players. And I could be all grognardy and tell you, well, I've never done that. And in one sense, I suppose I never have. I've never explicitly had a session where we explicitly talked about those things. But when I advertise a game, when I tell players that I'm going to run a game, I always tell them what I'm planning on doing. Not in the sense of the specific exact stuff, but the sort of things. My games tend to follow the rules of 1970s television, which means that we don't worry about how much violence we have. But sexual matters happen behind closed doors. And discussions of difficult matters, questions of abuse and so forth, are typically very limited. And I would definitely take into account what I know about my players before I got into something like that. But and this is also accommodation. This is understanding your players and their limitations. In this case, it's not physical limitations, but mental or emotional limitations, things they don't want to deal with. And you should take that into account too. If I advertise a game and somebody hears about it and they're like, well, that's going to be subject matter I'm not going to be comfortable with, they don't have to play. Or they could ask me, is this how this has to be? Is this how you're definitely going to run the game? And we could have a discussion about it. I would try to accommodate any friend who wanted to participate in one of my games as best I could. Having said that, this can be tricky because for some people, simply the level of violence in a standard tabletop role-playing game, standard Dungeons and Dragons, is too much. I would assume most people would know that without having to be told, but communication is as always important in a situation like this. But again, you're saying, well, if this wasn't obvious before the last couple of years, it should be obvious by now. It's a discussion that's being had throughout the tabletop role-playing communities, whether it's people poo-pooing it as something that, real old school players don't need, or whether it's somebody insisting that you should always do it. Whatever your position on it is, it's a discussion that's been had, so everyone should be aware of it. But and that seems obvious. But here's the point, and this was a while ago. I was asked to run a one-shot online game as a favor. I am not going to describe the situation in any more detail than that. I don't want to call out the person that asked this of me or any of the other people who participated in it. But it was asked as a favor, and I agreed to do it. It was a group of players I was not terribly familiar with. And what I did basically was I took one of my online scenarios. I have an online on Roll20 online version of one of my adventures that is suitable for new players in a new game. So it's a good one to use for a one shot, and it has a lot going on in it. Depending on which way you turn coming down the first set of stairs into the dungeon, you can have a completely different adventure. But I agreed to run this. I went to my Roll20 and I cleaned that up, put all the icons back where they belonged, made sure everything was ready to go. And game night came around, and the first and last thing that the person who asked me to do it did was to complain about how they didn't like virtual tabletops. Well, as I've said, I always use a virtual tabletop online. I've never really tried to run a Theater of the Mind game online, and I have reasons for preferring not to. Besides which, I had just put the effort into setting this all up for this group. I had put all the icons back where they belonged. I had created new tokens for their player characters. I had actually created new character sheets for the player characters. I was using our standard pre-gen set, but I had not previously used them with that adventure, so it all had to be put together from scratch, and I did that. The other players seemed to have a pretty good time. The player that had actually asked the favor of me complained about the virtual tabletop several times during the game and didn't seem to be looking at it, didn't seem to be paying attention to it. There were several situations where this player did not know where their character was in relation to opponents or traps or whatever, and had to be reminded to look at the Roll20 to see it. Now, there are two different things that came to my mind here as I was thinking about this today. The first was how chilling this particular player's speech would be if they were the game master or the game master's best friend in some new campaign and expressed how much they didn't like virtual tabletops or how much they didn't like battle mats and miniatures, how much they just wanted to play Theater of the Mind and so forth. That would be chilling to someone who was potentially joining the group who was aphantasic. People with aphantasia cannot see pictures in their minds, and they are, although I don't know that there's still good statistics on it, they are pretty common. A lot of people are. I know several aphantasic people. Playing a Theater of the Mind game is literally just not going to happen. Their theater's closed. They would see pictures in their minds. I have lots of other issues with running a Theater of the Mind game. I did it for years. Never thought twice about it. That's how I ran games for the first probably almost 2 decades of my career as a game master before I started using tokens and battle mats. But this was something that this person was just making clear, that they had no patience for it, that they had no understanding of it. They had nothing but disdain for those who wanted to use a virtual tabletop. It was all just a joke to them. And if you were aphantasic and this was the game master or the game master's best buddy, would you even dare to say something? Would you even say, well, I really need it? I can't see pictures in my mind. This would make things a lot better for me. And then the second thing, as I said, there's two parts to this. The second thing I thought about after I began putting this video together, after I began working out what I wanted to talk about, was this particular player, did they have some issue with using a battle mat, with using a virtual tabletop? Was there actually some reason other than contempt or disdain? Was there some reason other than a sense of superiority? Perhaps that projected sense of superiority is covering for some form of what this person might consider inferiority, some kind of a problem this person might suffer from, that they might not express verbally, that they might not even realize is a problem, that they might just think that the way they are is the way everybody should be. People do things for reasons. I've said this a lot. This has kind of become my mantra. Just because we don't know what their reasons are doesn't mean those reasons don't exist. And just because people do things for reasons doesn't mean their reasons are always good. But they're still reasons, and we should try to understand them if we can. This, as much as consent, is a subject that a game master should bring up in any kind of a session zero or any kind of a pre-game discussion with the players about what kind of game is going to be run. Make sure that regardless of what limitations, problems, or issues a player might have, if you care enough to want them in your game, you care enough to try to accommodate their problems or their needs. I don't want to say problems, needs. It is not fair to stigmatize people for the things they cannot do, or the things that are very difficult for them that they need assistance with. And I know there are people that would tell me that they're not necessarily friends with everybody at their table, but I'll tell you right now, I've never run a game for a group of players for any length of time and not ended up friends with them. If I'm willing to put up with them, week by week or month by month for a game, I have to like them. They have to be acceptable people to me. If I didn't, why would I put up with it? I'm not getting paid for this, after all. But this is what I want people to think about. This is where I want you to be. Think about how you approach starting a game, how you approach running a game, how you approach taking care of your players. I've said before that a game master's primary responsibility is to make sure the game is fun for everybody. And this is just part of it. Not just making sure everybody has something to do or a position for their character to where they can do the thing that their character is designed for or whatever, but so that the player themselves is comfortable and enjoys the game, finds the game enjoyable. I don't know that I have anything else to say on the subject, but and I never tell people to comment on my videos, but I'm going to tell you right now, I'd like to see your comments. Tell me about the situations that you've encountered with people who needed accommodations, or if you need accommodations. What sort of things make the game better or worse for you? I'm really curious to see everybody's response to this particular video. And as always, please, in the comments thread, be polite. Everybody has their thing, everybody has their reasons, and we need to try to work with them. I think that's all for this video. Thanks for listening.